Hello everyone. Hi. Welcome to today's Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and online. So whether you are in Bristol or far away, you are very welcome. My name is Danielle Rose and I work here at the Watershed as network producer. I'm a white woman with long blonde hair. I'm going to say a little bit more about the Pervasive Media Studio, and then I'm going to introduce Roy Kareem, today's speaker. So a very warm welcome to anyone here or online who's new to the studio. I'll tell you a bit more about us. So the Pervasive Media Studio is a partnership between Watershed, the University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol. We are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We are a home for embryonic ideas, research and development, and the building of new companies, and we're a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities to our residents as part of our spirit of generosity and mutual exchange. We are a space for people to take risks in their practice and to make time for collaboration. The Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talks are part of our Open Studio Friday offer. So every Friday, the studio throws open our doors and we offer the chance to spend time in the space with us. You can hot desk here for free from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. on Fridays. I'll just do a very quick bit of housekeeping. So if you need to, do feel free to move around. If you need a drink, we've got a kitchenette just at the back there. We also have a quiet space. So just around here, if there's a point where you need a break at any point, feel very free to use that. The fire exits are at either end of the studio. And one of the studio team wave, if we need to use them, we'll direct you. We've also got accessible toilets and baby change facilities just by the kitchen. So after this talk, a captioned version of the talk will be available on the same link after the talk is finished. And today, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So for those of you who are watching online, pop your questions into the YouTube chat. And if you're in the building, raise your hand and we'll be passing around a mic for the people who are in the building. So, today's talk. Today's talk is by Roy Kareem. Roy has been working with us as an audience development associate on Watershed's The Future is Collective programme, which propels community and climate activism by offering support and development to freelance creatives, and that programme is supported by Arts Council England. Roy is currently the director of Bright Green Future, an environmental leadership programme for 16 to 19-year-olds based at the Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol, which aims to greatly diversify those choosing professions that make a positive environmental impact. He is an alumni of the Black and Green Ambassadors for Bristol's programme, the creator of Park Life's podcast series, and is currently one of the hosts of Rise Up Breakfast Show on Ujima FM, a community radio station for Bristol. So thanks so much for joining us today, Roy, and over to you.
Amazing. Oh, well, cheers. Thank you. I was like, yeah, that sounds... That's what I do, sort of, and what a context to be talking about nature, because I'm going to be talking about awe, and that was a kind of awe-inspiring / roof-challenging amount of rain, apparently. So thank you very much for having me today. So I'm just going to caveat one thing, which I just realised as I was coming in, which is I had COVID a few weeks ago, as many people seem to be having at the moment. Which means the only thing I'm left with, I basically got off very lightly, but occasionally I'm like, so if that's happening, that's my only remnant from COVID. But when you do a radio show, that is extra awkward, where you sort of have to keep muting the mic. So, yeah, delighted to be here. I'm going to be talking about nature, its relationship to creativity, and then coaching, and trying to weave all those things together. So I'm also a trained coach. Coach being, well, we'll get into what a coach is. You know, people talk about life coaches, executive coaches, sports coaches, I guess is probably like one of the most common ones as well in the States. When I'm talking about coaching, it's more in the life coaching space. I particularly do it with young people. By young people, it's 16 to 19-year-olds mostly that I work with, and we do coaching with them. But I'm going to try and wrap it all up together as to why I think nature is an important part of that. We could spend the entire, how long we've got, going, what is nature? What do I mean by nature? For nature, for the context of this talk, I'm going to be talking about, generally I'm going to be the outdoors, is what I'm going to go to. We could use Oscar Wilde's definition of nature, which is a place where the birds fly around uncooked, which I quite like. But for our talk, we're gonna talk about it as just being the outdoors. Yes, that could mean the centre of Bristol, but in lots of my contexts, it will be sort of the slightly less urbanised version of the outdoors. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and do this in a slightly storytelling fashion. And I'm going to tell my story of the outdoors and nature through 3 different kind of places. My personal places. They are going to be London, which is where I was born and raised, pretty central. They are going to be the wild west coast of Scotland, where I spent big chunks of my childhood too. They are going to be Mtwara in southern Tanzania. And they are going to be Knoydart, which is another place on the west coast of Scotland, sometimes called the UK's last wilderness. So I'm going to talk about those places, and then I'm going to talk about some of the theories, some of the sort of the academic theories of why what happens to us when we're outdoors. How that affects our creativity, how we feel about each other, how we relate to each other. And then finally, I'm going to kind of wrap it all up with that coaching piece and why I now bring all of that kind of into the coaching arena. Or I should say, I'm at the very beginning of that journey. How I'd like to do more and more of that is probably a better way to say it. So we're going to begin with, and yes, then we'll have time for Q&As, and I'll do my best. And it'll probably be discursive rather than me giving you concrete answers. So we're going to begin in London. So I grew up in a neighbourhood called Tufnell Park, which is in the borough of Islington. Highly urbanised, radically changed from when my parents moved in the 1970s to where it is now. My parents, I would say, did that thing of not being particularly financially savvy, apart from buying a house in 1972 in London. That was kind of it. And it is what? Concreted, very little green space apart from people having gardens, which I say very little green space apart from having gardens. I believe 52% of London is green, and the vast majority of that is people's gardens. So it's like actually a huge part of London's habitats is people's gardens. So it's quite a green city. But overall, it's just like Victorian terrace houses. We had like one bit which is like the Tufnell Park playing fields, which is just like a uniform green lawn, which is where you just go and play football. And that was kind of it. And yet those green spaces, and I think this is kind of what the research is showing more and more, are kind of so vital to how people relate to each other and to their environment. And access to those green spaces. So, in the introduction, it was talked about, I was involved, still am involved with this program called the Black and Green Ambassadors for Bristol, which was trying to help give people of colour in the city of Bristol a platform to talk about sustainability and have their voices heard. And one of the things that I got really interested in was access to green spaces. And, lots of you will know this, but kind of like, the distribution of access is very unequal, depending on socioeconomics, depending on ethnicity, all those kinds of things. And that applies to London too. That's not like a Bristol-based phenomenon. But one of the academic things which I found fascinating about this sort of who has access to green space, who doesn't, and this made me reflect on growing up in London, was how it affects our relationships with other people. Not to do with our relationship so much with nature or the outdoors, but how it affects how we respond to each other as citizens. So one of the things I was going to flag was this researcher called Frances Kuo, who works in Chicago in the US. And she looked at different housing projects, we might call them council estates in the UK, different housing projects, some of which, and she looked at a particular one had access to courtyards which were concrete, one had access to courtyards which were greened. And they basically were next door to each other. So the community who lived there was pretty much the same. Those who visited was pretty much the same. And she said, like, what difference does it make if you have greenery in your courtyard versus not green? And you could jump to where this is kind of going. But the actual statistics were kind of mind-blowing. I've got them here in front of me. Compared to buildings with lower amounts of vegetations, those with medium levels experience 42% fewer total crimes. And the contrast between the lowest and highest levels of vegetation was even more pronounced. Buildings with the most green views saw 48% fewer property crimes and 56% fewer violent crimes than buildings with the least greenery. And it's one of those things where you could start to like pull that in all kinds, like, oh, why was that? Oh, is it because is it easier to climb into a building that, you know, has less vegetation? And they looked at all of this, and the only explanation they came up with was like, no, there was something non-physical happening in terms of the consequences of just having a bit more vegetation. And they were just like, well, is it just like, you know, does the greenery somehow just chill people out and just like, you know, lull people into sort of, oh, okay, like we just kind of, but that wasn't the entire thing. What they actually concluded was that it just drew people outside. Essentially, having a slightly greener place drew them outside. And that drawing people outside significantly improved how people related to each other. So I've got a quote here. The greenery courtyard residents reported their neighbors were more concerned with helping and supporting one another, had stronger feelings of belonging, engaged more in social activities, and had more visitors. So they felt very different about those people next to them than the ones with kind of just more concrete. And it wasn't a big shift, and you didn't need a huge amount of kind of more greenery to make that happen. And if you think about Bristol and how it's developing, what's going up, what's not going up, it would be wonderful to imagine that some of that is being planned into things. And some places, yes, but some places not. And what are we baking in to our cities when we're not accounting for those kinds of things? What are we setting in place for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years in terms of how people relate to each other? That's my kind of London context, and that's some of the research behind it. And I will say Frances Kuo, the person I quoted, she comes out of this kind of long lineage, and we'll get to sort of the origins of this, of these two really significant psychologists called the Kaplans. They're a couple. And they're, for a lot of the stuff I'm talking about, they're sort of the foundational sort of academics behind a lot of this. So, London. Now let's go to Iona. So the island of Iona is off the west coast of Scotland. It has 120 people that live on it. 21 of those are relations of mine. That is true. I was there about 3 weeks ago. And I've basically been going, so my grandparents kind of married into the island, several generations, kind of sort of grown and lived there. And we spent, as kids, every summer there. I believe we were probably the only brown children within a 150-mile radius. But never felt anything apart from, like, you know, love and kindness, and it was generally a wonderful experience. No cars on the island, or there weren't. I mean, there are a few now. It's not like a wild kind of wilderness, but it is pretty kind of remote. And there's not much there apart from the outdoors. What experience did that have? I mean, I went there first, I think, when I was 18 months old, 2 years old. What experience for a child to have that continually kind of in their lives, to get to know an outdoor space, to know that that rock's over there. Oh, and the best little cove to go to is kind of around that bit, but you can only do that when the tide's like that. from a little kid from London, like how did that shape me? I don't know is the answer. I don't know how that shaped me. The second academic theory that might help me think about it is called actor network theory. Some of you may have come across it. It's from the social sciences. A guy called Bruno Latour, a French guy, and a bunch of other people kind of came up with it. I am not clever enough to give you a decent explanation of it, but what's interesting about it is, the way a social scientist might look at sort of networks of people and sort of explain things like, okay, well, you've got this much power and you've got this much power, and we kind of, we can all relate to each other in this way. What actor network theory does, and this is why it's slightly quote unquote controversial, is it gives humans and non-humans the same amount of value in this, what they call an assemblage. For some reason, I don't know why, they don't use the word network when they're actually talking about it. They start talking about assemblages. I don't know why. So a classic example would be, when Facebook talks about how many users has Facebook got, like 2 billion or something like that. Let's say Facebook, the Facebook network has 2 billion users. Actor network theory would say, no. It's got 2 billion users, and then it's got 2 billion phones, and it's got 500 million tablets, and 500,000 server units, and they are as important as the humans using the network. And people, that kind of freaks people out a little bit, of kind of just like, well, no, obviously, like, the human is more important than the phone. Like, that's like, that's obvious. And it's like, not in this kind of world. So how does that relate to Iona? Well, then when you start to talk about the non-human having as much value as the human, that means that the rocks and the plants and everything else that makes up that experience for me has the same value. So what does that begin to do when we start to break things down? The other thing that actor network theory does, it's a bit like, I don't know if you ever looked at like those fractal things where you kind of like zoom in and zoom out and you kind of go, woo, and it's like, oh, there's everything, and you go in again, it's like, oh, there's more. Actor network theory does the same thing where it goes, what would be a good example? A birthday cake, right? A birthday cake. If you're looking at a birthday cake in actor network theory, you might be like, okay, within the assemblage of the cake, that word assemblage again is, flour and sugar and all the things that make up the cake. That's all part of that little one. But we can zoom into that, and actually the flour is its own little assemblage of thing. Okay, what goes into the flour? Okay, well, you've got to grind the flour, you've got to grow the wheat. Okay, there's a whole thing there. Or we can zoom back out again. But the cake is part of its own thing. It's part of a birthday party and a Eurocentric diet, and all this other stuff. So that's the other thing that actor network theory does, is it sort of does this weird sort of scaling thing of kind of like, okay, for me, I'm in Iona, I've got the rocks and the plants and stuff, I've got my own stuff going on inside me, and then also it goes, and then this West Hebridean ecology is part of everything else as well. And I think for me, as a single-digit person, as a teen, as a 20-year-old, as a 30-year-old, going back to that same place and that same habitat, basically raised my consciousness of being part of something bigger than myself, of starting to place, in the best way possible, devaluing me, shrinking my ego a little bit, and raising the value of everything else. And I think you can get that in different ways, but one way you can really get it is through outdoor experiences in a repeated fashion in the same place, and just getting to know a place and a place and a place. I should have a show of hands, just because, I think this will work for the online audience as well. Who has a outdoor space that is of repeated significance for them over their lives? Just curious. Okay, like sort of, just about the majority, I would say, just about the majority. Yeah, and maybe when we get to the Q&A, it'd be interesting to sort of pull out kind of like, what is that place and why is it important? And interestingly, I've had these conversations with people. It's not always the fact that it's like, oh, it's like, the mountains of New Zealand. It could be like, for me, it was a back garden in London. Like that was just like, that was its own sort of just like magical landscape, even though it wasn't like, you know, it doesn't sometimes seem significant from the outside, I think. So we've looked at Chicago crime rates. We've looked a bit at French social science actor network theory. The next place we're going to go is to Mtwara in the very, very south of Tanzania on the border with Mozambique. So being a middle-class North London kid, I obviously did the classic thing of when I finished my secondary school education of like taking a gap year, right? That's like kind of like you're going to have to do. So I worked in London in a really crap job for like 7 months, saved up that money, gave it all to an organization, which I'm still not entirely sure about, and then went off and did one of these like conservation projects. And as cynical as you might be, or I might be about that, it was a profoundly transformational experience. Can't separate out the different bits, but basically what we were doing is quote unquote marine conservation work, scuba diving for like 4 months on places that basically had never seen a diver before. And yeah, that was our existence of just like get up in the morning, get our gear ready, go out and dive and dive and dive. And so we were basically in this underwater world for hours on end, every day, month on month. And yes, there was also a group of 17 other, you know, late teens, early 20s kind of folk. And so there's like, you know, so all that stuff, we were away from home, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff going. But for me, I cannot at all separate that outdoor experience and how transformational that was. And who's, again, a show of hands, who's scuba dived in their lives ever? Okay. I mean, it's a weird experience, right? Like, even if you've only done it like once or twice, it's a strange thing to just like, you know, descend into about as alien a world as you can on planet Earth. But to do it just like again and again and again, and just to sort of actually, for that experience to sort of just embed itself is, for me, was anyway really transformative. And the research I kind of want to reflect on there is this idea of awe and what awe does to us. Because there's a lot of stuff around that, and awe also with the psychological concept of flow, which probably lots of you might have heard about. So flow, you know, being a state of kind of like, you know, where you're really, basically you're really sort of engaged in a complete way with something, be that a work task or a sport or wherever it might be, where it's challenging enough, but not too challenging, so it kind of holds your attention. It has some overlaps with this concept of awe. So, you know, awe where suddenly you find yourself insignificant in front of something much larger. And outdoor experiences seem to trigger this way, way, way more than anything else. So whether that's, you know, climbing up a mountain, or for me being 40 meters under the water, there is something about that which, and this is what the researchers showed, is specific to inducing social cohesion amongst groups of people. And as one of the researchers beautifully said, awe wants to be shared. And so for me, when I reflect back, of like, well, of course, like, you know, I was there doing these like just awe-inspiring experiences. And then I was with like a group of like 12 people for months on end. And it sort of all begins to sort of fit together for me of just like, you know, we just kind of formed this just like immense bond of just like, you know, oh, like, you know, did you see that? And just like, how was that? And just like, I think, you know, all these chemicals were flowing through us, just like reinforcing and reinforcing and reinforcing. And it gets to something which cuts across cultures, which is this idea of, again, when you're in that sort of late teen stage, of going out into the wilderness and having one of these kind of rites of passage experiences. And, I kind of looked into it, and when you kind of especially get to, older cultures in terms of, maybe not so much for us anymore in our westernized existence, but having that kind of experience was fundamental kind of to a lot of these cultures of how do you transition from childhood to adulthood. And so for me, that was kind of fundamental to my shift to becoming an adult. And I think, one of the slightly sad things that we've probably lost is building that, into our culture. So the bit, that kind of awe stuff relates to kind of, remember I talked about the Kaplans, these kind of like fundamental sort of psychologists, so kind of a lot of this work. So a lot of it rests on their theory, which is called attention restoration theory, or ART. Attention restoration theory basically says that because we're designed to be outdoors, the outdoors often presents us with this beautiful phrase, an experience of soft fascination. Soft fascination being where something draws us in enough, but kind of not so much where we're sort of anxious about kind of like keeping an eye on things, like feeling like we really have to concentrate, where it's stimulating, but not too stimulating. And their argument is that basically being in the outdoors provides that to us in abundance. And it's not trying to do that, it's just because our brains have evolved to be in that environment. And they find that it's completely also restorative. That kind of one of the big things it does is closes those kind of like the executive centers, making our decisions, basically our consciousness and how we're going to drive things. Press switch. Oh, that's all right. And what they find, and then what they find in nature is that starts to quiet down, that prefrontal cortex starts to dial down. And what comes back online, or what gets amplified, is this thing called our default mode network. Default mode network is essentially where we're not thinking about the future, we're not thinking about the past. We're just kind of drifting. You can get access to that through, I believe, meditation can get you to a similar place. Psychedelics can have like similar effects. You begin to sort of shrink the ego down. And again, that feeling of something, I'm part of something bigger than myself. And so that attention restoration theory is kind of like part of that, of kind of like, okay, just dial down this kind of thinking, dial down another big thing, rumination, which, is something that we all do and we kind of find very hard to stop. Dials those things down, gives us enough to be stimulated, but not too much where we're sort of anxious. So, London, Iona, Mtwara in southern Tanzania, and the final place, Knoydart on the west of Scotland. So Knoydart, big bit of wilderness, got one road in and out. I believe has the most remote pub in the UK, which you have to take like a 40-minute boat ride to get to. I never made it there, but I did like a sort of a training, I guess, or a retreat. I'm not quite sure what you call it, with a group called Natural Change, who I don't know if they're still in existence. They might be in some form, but essentially they did sort of these big outdoor facilitation training exercises. You go out to this completely remote place. You spend a week there, and then you do a solo where you kind of go off by yourself into the Scottish wilderness, and you do it for a day, or you can do it for as long as you want. But I think we were just doing them for like a dawn till dusk kind of one. And before you do your solo, you kind of do all these sort of build-up exercises. You're getting to know the land a bit. You're getting to know the rest of your group. But that, whatever it was, ended up being 12 hours, was significantly transformative for, I think, for me and from what I could see for the rest of the group. And all we did was go and sit in a spot for 12 hours and come back again. In fact, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, there's a guy in Bristol, Andres Roberts, who now sort of does these kinds of things. I think they're called Way of Nature. And you come back and then you do a certain sort of, I won't go into it, but a certain kind of like reflective process about what your experience just was. But for me, doing that and being out there and having to be in that space was transformative in a way which I couldn't figure out. Like I was like, why did that feel so significant? Yeah, there was like an amazing landscape. There was like the group dynamics of like different people, but why was that transformative? And it was only once I started to sort of, because this is the way my mind works, and I like to know like the theories, and I like to know what the evidence is. It was only when I started to look into sort of, okay, the awe aspect, the attention restoration, like all these things of like, oh, okay. And then behind all of it was the final theory I mentioned, which is maybe one you've heard of, biophilia. Biophilia, it was kind of made famous by this guy, E.O. Wilson, who was like a Harvard, I think he was an entomologist, like studying insects. And he kind of built on somebody else's work, but he basically said, our brains were built for the outdoors. We just have a natural affinity for being in nature and being with life. And yet, kind of the more we kind of urbanize and build in technology, he often would describe those as being dead. So we're sort of surrounding ourselves with dead things, so no wonder we start to kind of feel a bit crappy. We need to go and be next to life to kind of restore ourselves. So that concept of biophilia kind of just like underpins like all that kind of other stuff. Is that we're just like, we were born to be, primates in the savannas of Africa, and yet we've created a sort of completely different life. I wouldn't describe it as anti-technology or anti-development. It's just a recognition of like, okay, well, if we're for that, then no wonder we kind of feel better when we're there. So how does that then kind of relate to this coaching piece? Oh, by the way, kind of like on that specific creativity front, there was an amazing study which was, they basically took a group of 100 people out into like an outdoor space. And they were like, how are we gonna like, they were really kind of interested in like outdoors and the creativity, like what was the relationship? And so, being psychologists, they came up with some creative ways of measuring creativity, giving them different tasks or asking them to come up with like an original piece of artwork and stuff. And they did this kind of repeated experiment with different groups of people. And I think it took about like 36 hours of being in like an outdoor environment. But the levels of people's creativity, the sort of exponential growth was like, kind of like the research was like, well, this can't be right, we better repeat it again. And every time they did it, it was just like this. And there is something I think supremely interesting, specifically around that sort of creative piece. And I think throughout culture, kind of we hear about people taking retreats and sort of doing those things. They're like, okay, I need to write that book. I'm going off to a cabin and I'm going to do that. So in some ways, it's maybe not a surprise that kind of like they found those results. But as with a lot of this stuff, it's like, well, how do we begin to integrate that into what we've created here? Do I just need some more plants in my office? Do I need to do something kind of more radical than that? And one of the beautiful things that somebody came up with was this idea of the nature pyramid. So I guess it's based on like, is there a food pyramid? Yeah, there's a food pyramid, right? Of kind of like, you should eat a very small amount of this stuff, and then at the bottom, this is what most of your diet should be made up of, like, green leafy vegetables and blah, blah, blah. So someone created one of these for nature, like how much nature do we need in our lives? And at the very top, if I'm getting it right, so the things you need, but maybe like the least often, actually no, let's start the other way. The things daily you would need, so the big chunk of the pyramid at the bottom of the base, is half an hour being outdoors. So, in an urban environment, whether that's going to a green space, having a walk around, the water, whatever it might be, but half an hour a day, which is obviously also kind of relates to what they recommend for exercise, but yeah, half an hour a day. And then kind of as you go up the pyramid, it was kind of like, okay, once a month, you need a slightly bigger exposure. And I think it's something like doing a multi-hour sort of experience in, you know, for us, maybe it's going to like Lee Woods for like a couple of hours a week, something like that. And then it's got a monthly one, and the monthly one is, I think it was something like basically a day in sort of a bit more of a wilderness area. So going off to the Brecon Beacons for like a day. And then the very peak was annually or biannually, so as in once or twice a year, doing like a multi-day proper wilderness kind of thing. So like, you know, going out camping out in the middle of wherever it might be and spending a few days there. And this was sort of their recommended thing. And I like it because I like a bit of structure even when we're talking about these things. And yet, you know, if I look at that myself, if I look at that nature pyramid, yeah, maybe I get like, you know, I drop my daughter off at primary school and I kind of like will walk back, but the rest of it, and this is for someone who's like kind of interested in this stuff. Each year, am I out for like, you know, 8 days out in the wild? Nope. Each month, am I spending a day like doing that? Each week, am I off in like, you know, Lee Woods having like 4 or 5 hours in Lee Woods? No, I'm not. Is my daughter, who's 8 years old, doing that? Am I taking her out there and doing those things with her? I'm not. And so it's just like an interesting reflection of kind of like, yeah, what the research, what our instinct tells us that we need, and actually our own ability to sort of fulfill that need. So the coaching piece. So the coaching, okay, what is coaching? I just like to think of a coach as a thinking partner, like someone that you can relate to. If we say what it's not, if we talk about a mentor is someone there essentially to give advice. You say to the mentor, hey, I've got this issue. A mentor would say, oh, have you thought about doing that? Oh yeah, I had a similar experience to that. Oh yeah, have you thought about, you know, speaking to that person or accessing that resource? A coach, in the way I've been trained anyway, a coach believes that the client has all the resources that they need to be able to solve that problem. And all it's a matter of doing is servicing that. So in the language of my trainers, that every client is naturally resourceful, whole and complete, or something like that. That's not quite right. But essentially everything's already there, and all you're doing is helping to sort of catalyze that and surface that, as opposed to maybe a bit more of the parenting model of kind of like, oh, I've got an answer. What you need to do is hear my answer. Now, that's not to say that is sometimes absolutely needed, but the coaching model is quite different from that. And so I've worked with someone who, she's a psychotherapist, but she's also a coach who works in London. And now she conducts all of her psychotherapy and all of her coaching 100% outdoors. She just doesn't do it indoors. And so she's built this model up of where you've got the coach, the client, and then the outdoors is like the third part of that triangle. And what's really interesting about it is you know, number one, I think probably, this is not number one, I was about to say probably you can charge more. No, that's not what I meant. I meant number one is that the outdoors is doing so much of the work for you in terms of supporting that client. You know, if I've just said, you know, it's reducing your stress, your levels of cortisol, it's shrinking your ego a little bit so you're able to sort of have enhanced creativity. The outdoors is doing that, all of that for you, and then there you are as the coach or the therapist or whatever it might be, taking advantage of all that goodness that's happening and being able to sort of have far more transformative effects. And so now this is something I've built into the work that I do with young people. So I work with 16 to 19-year-olds. We do this environmental leadership empowerment program, and what we kick it off with is a 5-day residential. And, you know, there are limits to kind of what we do. It's not a survival course, so we're not able to go and kick them all off for like 2 days and say, hey, go and do a solo and, you know, here's a foil blanket and we'll see you in a couple of days. There are safeguarding limits to what we can do. But what we do start to do is just introduce them to some of the concepts that I've talked about and why actually being in the outdoors can have these sort of transformative effects. Especially, I mean, this is for all of us, right? It doesn't matter if you're 80 years old or 7 years old. Some of those effects are happening. But there does seem to be something in particular about this transition from childhood to adulthood. So one of the things we get them to do is really simply is sit spots. Sit spots being where you go and you just pick an outdoor space and you sit for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, or whatever it might be, and you simply observe. And you're not saying, okay, I want you to focus on your breath, or I want you to do this particular meditation. It's literally you just go and sit and see what's around you. And then we get our students to do that when they go off for the rest of the 6 months program. We don't get to see them because it's all there, all around the UK. We get them to do that at least once a month, or we try and get them to do it once a week and report back, like, how is that process? How is it going back to that same bench in your park and seeing the seasons change as you do that? How is it? And obviously we try and get them to not be with your phone, just for switch it off for like 20 minutes. What comes up for you? Why is that so uncomfortable? Because for a lot of our young people, it is. For a lot of us, it is. Like, why is it uncomfortable to just sit with your own thoughts for like 20 minutes? And then on that actual coaching piece, I mean, and again, this is like ancient knowledge, the ability to like what comes up when you walk versus when you sit. When you go for a walk with a client outdoors, why do people sort of find that so much more transformative than if you're sitting with a client in an office room? And so, what we've started to realize when we're doing some sort of our coaching work is that, yeah, you can have really sort of a catalyzing effect by simply sort of taking that practice outdoors. And then the next stage is then what can you do to actually utilize what's there in terms of the natural environment. So we'll get our young people to do kind of land art activities. To say rather than say, hey, like how are you feeling like right now? Like, as you come out of secondary school and you kind of like go into the next steps, how are you feeling? Because for a lot of our young people, they don't have the language to talk about it, don't like to talk about it. What we'll say is like, make something for me. Like out of the materials you just found here, or like by a river or in the woods, make something that sort of shows me what you're feeling right now. And like, what? And just like whatever comes up. And you say, just take like half an hour to do that. And so they start to build something. Then you go, okay, everyone, that's half an hour up. Like, oh no, can we just like a bit more time? Just like a bit more time. I'm just getting like super, like, okay, yeah, take another half hour. Okay. And then what we do is we do like a gallery process where we walk around, all the students walk, and we'll go and see each person's artwork and we say, like, tell me about this. And that they can talk about. And then again, as opposed to where it's a medium which is, in our actor network theory, the medium would be as important as the artist, right? And yet when they're human-made mediums, when you're giving them a tablet or a pencil, whatever it is, that's coming with a certain maybe extra value, extra expectation. When it's a pine cone and it's a leaf, I think there's a freedom there that our students feel to be able to sort of begin to interpret things in a slightly less, it's more meaningless in the best way possible. It's not as laden with sort of expectations as if you kind of give them a collage and a Pritt stick or whatever it might be. And the other thing you get to do, and then I'll wrap up, the other thing you get to do with coaching and sort of that is, I'm just going to talk through an example of kind of like an exercise we would do with our young people in a sort of coaching dynamic. It's called Mirror. And essentially we'll go to a certain spot where we're out on our residential and it's got a beautiful vista of kind of like the surrounding landscapes. And you say, right, in pairs, go off. And we'll demonstrate this to our students before they go off and do it. And we'll say, okay, one of you is going to be the coach, one of you is going to be the client. So it's kind of like a peer-to-peer kind of coaching situation. One of you sit in front, one of you sits behind. So the client sits in front, coach sits behind. And the coach says to the client, so all the client can see is what's in front of them in terms of the landscape. They say, and you say, the coach says to the client, what do you see? And, you know, I'm obviously going to make this up, but it'd be like, okay, yeah, I see some trees, I see some fields, I think there's a farm there, and some buildings, and they go, and they go, and they go. And then when they sort of naturally become silent, the coach goes, what do you see? And they go, okay, well, yeah, I mean, that tree, I think it's probably died off because, like, you know, it doesn't have leaves. Oh, there's some sheep over there. Then the coach goes, what do you see? Obviously, you can understand when you're a 17-year-old, this might get a little bit annoying, but you basically do it until the person goes, like, I'm done. Like, as in, I think I've said everything. Coach says, next question, what do you need? And they go, help? Someone to talk to? Bit of direction? They stop. Coach goes, what do you need? I don't know. What do you need? They go, I'm done for now. And what you're able to do with the natural landscape, which you are not able to do with kind of a lot of other places, is to play with more of a blank canvas. Be able to get people to sort of respond in a way that they are not able to if you're in this lovely setting of kind of like, you know, there is so much like embedded meaning in everything that we build. And obviously you can argue, like, in the UK's landscape, it's a very like manufactured landscape, right? You know, it wasn't fields and it wasn't farmhouses, but there's more to play with there. There's a richness there that you can't get from just being in an urban center. You just can't get it. So that's kind of like one of the ways we begin to play with this sort of coaching client nature kind of relationship, and also beginning to take advantage of that, which we see with the people that we work with, this massive boost in creativity, social cohesion, all those kinds of things we talked about, and being able to go, okay, if we've got that, if that's like our free bonus, what do we then do with that? So, I feel like I've talked enough. Yeah, but I'm just like, really like intrigued as to what some of your experiences have been, if you're like, what some of those potentially meaningful spaces for you were, and then just any random questions or comments you may have. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Jade's just grabbed the mic, so if anyone in this space has a question, if you raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. And also if you are watching online, please do put your comments and questions into the chat, which Jade will read out as well. Any questions in the space?
We've got one online.
Brilliant.
No trolls.
And if you could hold it as close.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I'm definitely going to go sit outside for a bit. I wanted to ask you, in a world where with ever decreasing green spaces, do you think sort of synthetic fake green spaces would have the same effect, you know, like with astroturf and fake plants, as actual nature?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. So there's a prison in the US that has something called the Blue Room, and basically they project scenes of nature kind of onto the wall. I'm guessing also scenes of like marine life. I was like, why is it called the Blue Room? I'm suddenly thinking, and that they show, and I think it's also the prison gym. So people like, these like, you know, big dudes are going up and doing their chin-ups while watching like scenes of nature. And it seems to, I don't know if they've run the statistics like properly, but had a marked reduction in terms of sort of levels of aggression and people being needed to pulled out of their cells for like mental health. So I guess yes, yeah. I mean, I think there absolutely is. I think you can sort of like fake it to a certain extent, and like obviously like in that prison, like we should, as in like I think those interventions are good. You see it also. They've run, you know, studies in hospitals where I mean, first of all, where you've got like massively reduced recovery rates where you have a view of like a tree versus if you have a view of something else. But they've also done the thing where they've like, well, in next room, what about we just put an LCD up and show pictures of nature? And again, it's not quite as big as effect, but it's still there. So yeah, I think I mean, you know, to a certain extent, we're not massively sophisticated as a species. You can trick us. And I think take advantage of that where you can, while also going, we actually also need to create actual kind of spaces for that. Because, I mean, there are also physiological things that happen outdoors which you can't fake. Like, you know, you'll know this, but, you know, there's a concept of like forest bathing in Japan that we sort of westernized and brought into us, which is all about that stuff I talked about. But also, like, the trees are just like releasing all these like beautiful chemicals for us that do things. And so I think, you know, there's an interplay there of like, yeah, you can have a bit of that, but then also there's other things which are happening which are kind of, I think, harder to try and replicate with that. Yeah, yeah, no worries.
Should we do the question online and then I'll bring it back to the room if that works?
So the person online says, do you see transformative engagement with nature as playing a role in the wider cultural and mindset shift that needs to happen to combat the climate and environmental crisis?
Yeah, oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of the things. So Bright Green Futures is, you know, this program that I run for young people. And, you know, when you're trying to get money for things, you have to write all these kind of bids. And, you know, in order to do that, you'll, what they call, you know, do a theory of change of like, we're doing this because then this will happen and this will happen. And one of the things we put in those bid documents was kind of like, in order for people to want to be actively taking positive environmental action, like fundamentally before that, they have to have probably a different relationship and a different mindset to nature, right? There's something sort of that needs to happen before that. So yeah, in answer to that question, yes, I do think it's part of that. And it's then, what do you do about it? That's the heart of it. It's like, yes, absolutely. I think you need to have some kind of recognition of our connection to nature as being fundamental to then, are we going to do anything about when we're starting to lose it at a sort of practical level? So whether that's just getting more people outdoors, is it as simple as that? Like, I mean, if you look at different cultures, those rates are like astounding. Like Finland. I mean, like, it's always like one of those ones like where you're just like, oh, I've got a statistic about Finland, where it's something like, you know, most people would say they spend significant amounts of time outdoors. In the US, it's 30%. In the UK, it's 30%. And in Finland, it's 95%. Something ridiculous. It's in my notepad. 35% of Finns regularly go berry picking. 28% of them regularly do long distance ice skating. Like as in just like, it's just like baked into the culture in terms of outdoor experiences just being a regular part of life. So is that part of kind of like how you transform kind of people's connecting to nature, and would that have a significant effect on like how people are engaged in terms of the climate crisis? I think so, but I think there's probably a lot of other stuff that you need to do alongside that, as opposed to just be like, oh, we just get people outdoors, then they'll all become kind of climate activists. I think sadly it's probably more complicated than that, but yeah.
Thank you. And I think Lucy, you have a question.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Great talk.
How did I do?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
I didn't even heckle you once.
I know.
I don't know if this is a comment or a question. We'll see when I get there. But yeah, so my transformative space like has changed my relationship with it over the years. Like when I was 15, it was like a place and source of like great trauma and just upset. And now like I'm nearly 30 and it's actually really healing, and it's where I go like when I'm like crumbling. And I just wanted to know like your relationship with your transformative spaces. Has it changed over time, or have you changed over the time, like your relationship with it, or? Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. So what's weird about kind of this for me, I think, is like I'm maybe you picked up on this. Like I'm not like I'm not like a big outdoorsy person. Like I'm not like a naturally like I didn't grow up like going camping and hiking and I haven't brought that into my adult life. So all of this as an adult is definitely like a clawing kind of back of just like, oh, I know I need it and I know it's good for me, and yet I feel super uncomfortable kind of doing it. And you know, with the Black and Green ambassadors, we got into like, oh, why do people of color kind of feel the way they do when they're in outdoor spaces? Like that, all that is to say is kind of like my relationship with some of those sort of outdoor spaces. Yeah, I think it has changed a lot. I think it has changed a lot of kind of from in some of them, I think I've maybe gone on the reverse of kind of like, I feel less comfortable and less safe than I did as a kid. Like, because as a kid, I think I wasn't thinking about it. I was just like, oh, I'm just like out there, you know. And now I'm more like, I'm not consciously there going like, oh, I'm worried about this, I'm worried about that. I'm just kind of like, maybe I've become so urbanized that I'm just like used to just like all those comforts and I'm used to the stimulation. And when you take that away from me, I'm just like, oh, I guess it's just me. Yes. And like, here I am. And I kind of don't like that feeling, which, yeah, I guess a lot of us don't. And yet the one caveat to that is when people ask me about, or did ask me about my outdoor experiences, I used to always have that rote answer of like, oh, I'm not an outdoorsy person, da da da. And then I'd be like, I mean, I guess I have gone scuba diving like 680 times, whatever it is I've done. I used to do it as part of my job as well. Like I used to, you know, I'm like, oh yeah, as in like, oh, and it's just like, but because my mind is so fixed and just like, to be a British outdoors person means going camping, or it means going rambling. As I was like, and I just didn't have like a different framing for that. So yeah, that's a very rambling answer. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. And so this is like, I guess, a request for insight that goes through some other stuff. I'm from Reading, and growing up, I was very like facing Reading town. And then as an adult, got much more involved with spending time by the river, by the Thames, especially when I was really ill. I used to go to the Thames all the time. And yeah, it was really transformative. And a lot of the theories that you talked about, I'm like, okay. I'm like thinking about those now. But during lockdown, the little bend of the river where we are was absolutely full of the teenagers who didn't have anywhere to go and didn't have anything to do. And they were leaving lots of trash, and the older people were putting up lots of PASAG signs. And it was really challenging, actually, like socially, to see how much the elders weren't seeing what the young people were going through and how much they needed to be outdoors and getting smashed in order to deal with what they were going through, you know. And one of the things I would ask myself is, I really wonder what this experience is going to be like in a few years' time, once those young people have had a chance to integrate it. Like that summer where, rather than school, we just went down to the river every day and got smashed, you know? There's something, I'm saying got smashed, but there's something initiatory about like intense intoxication, and also about spending extended time outdoors in nature. And so I'm just wondering if you have any insights or reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, wow, like the pandemic like itself is just like, how like people's relationship with the outdoors during a pandemic, and just like what that shift was like, what suddenly parks meant to people that had never kind of like gone to parks, or what people's balconies meant to suddenly to people. I think that's like a really interesting like observation about the young people of just kind of like, and you're right, like, you know, being like getting super inebriated and altering your mind state and having an outdoor experience again is something that's just like, you know, is part of our culture, whether, you know, it's ayahuasca or like whatever it might be. And, you know, just those people, those young people in particular, kind of like what that means, I don't know, but it's fascinating. Like, it's going to be fascinating of just like, and does it rekindle anything in terms of kind of people's like want and need and sort of recognition of just like, oh, like I need that, like there is something that is lacking within me, within my community, within my culture, and is that an answer to it? Yeah, and how can it be fostered? Because there's so much else pulling us in different places. So yeah, I don't know. Is my answer. I don't know.
Thank you. I think because of we'll just take this one last question if that's okay. Great.
Hi there. Yeah, I've been really enjoying what you're talking about, particularly the experiences that you were talking about when you were younger that were really informative. I was just wondering about yourself when you came back to London when you were young, that transition period and how you were able to deal with that. And also the young people that you now work with, do you find anything that comes up for them? And do they then go off and search for their own spaces within maybe the environments that they, excuse me, that they come from?
Yeah, great question. I hope they do, but honestly, I don't know. Kind of like, yeah, what they take in that sort of specific kind of like, do they go off and like, yeah, generate their own sort of special place? I don't know. And then for me, sort of like, after, for example, that experience in like East Africa, coming back, I remember it being like really like freaky, like really kind of like an odd experience. My best like anecdote is watching the clock is one of the guys that ran that natural change experience I was talking about. He loves to go off and do like these multi-day solos. And he always tells a story of, and he was basically warning us about being out in nature and then coming back into the world and like how it can be a bit of a disruptive experience. And he tells a story really quickly of, he'd been off like west coast of Scotland, came back into Edinburgh Waverley Station, which is like the big main train station, walked up to the Costa coffee counter and stood there. And the barista was there. And then after like a minute, he was like, "Excuse me." She's like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you." And he's like, got his coffee, took it, went and sat on the train. It was a completely empty carriage down to London. He was like, "Ah, brilliant." So I sat down there, completely empty carriage, saw a woman walk past like on the outside of the train. She got on the carriage, walked all the way down the carriage, and just sat down on his lap. I was like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there." And and she got up and just went and sat somewhere else. And he always puts it down to that, like being out in nature at some point, just like, and this gets a bit woo-woo, obviously, but he was just like whatever state I was in, I was not like radiating like, hey, like I'm a guy, I'm like a high energy, like urban person. He was just like in some sort of just like, it was just kind of like state. And I do think there is a weird like reintegration that needs to happen, and you sort of need to be a bit gentle with yourself. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for questions today, but Roy is around for some more time this afternoon. So if you're in the studio, feel free to grab in person. And also if you're online, if you go to the Watershed website and to the studio projects page, you can read more about the project, the Future is Collective, in which Roy is working with us on. And through that project, Roy has some capacity to talk to freelancers. So kind of get in touch with the contact details are on that website if you would like to either feedback about the talk today or to perhaps have a session with
Coaching
Roy.
session. We'll go for a walk, people.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, honestly, yeah.
So thank you so much. If you could give Roy. Great. And thank you to you as well. So next week's talk will be BSL Interpreted, and it's also our last talk before a summer break, as there won't be any talks in August. So Sophie Shaw and James Wheel, who are the founders of Stormjar, will be talking about their immersive experience company, which explores the future of the haunted house. So they're going to be sharing some of their learnings and insights and tools that they've discovered along the way of developing that. And for those of you who are here in person, if you want to stick around and hot desk today, you're really welcome. And if you want to find out more about what we do, then please find a member of the studio team, which is me, and then a few other people around. And if you're watching online, do drop us a line on the studio at watershed.co.uk if you've got any questions. So thank you so much for being here. We'll see you all again, the same time, same place next week. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Roy. Cheers.